Hi, welcome back to Reading Mountains Beyond Mountains with me. Last time we had chapters 16 and 17, which talked about how Dr. Farmer and his colleagues overcame a lot of obstacles to provide healthcare to Peruvians who had multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Today we'll start with chapter 18. In April 1998, a special meeting about TB was convened at the American Academy of Arts and Science in Boston. A meeting to present early results from the small MDR treatment project in Peru. The meeting was Howard Hiat's idea. Socios was now treating more than 100 people with MDR in the northern slums of Lima. They had been treating the first 53 for the better part of the 2 years, and the results were in. It appeared that more than 85% were cured. Their patients were younger on average and had fewer accompanying illnesses than Dr. Eisman's in Denver. And as with many illnesses, youthfulness and the absence of comorbidity were therapeutic advantages. Even so, the cure rate was remarkable. An astonishing result, Howard Hiat had said. The world must hear this news, he declared. He hoped, among other things, that if the right people heard it, PIH might be able to secure more financing for their new project. A lot of the world's ranking tuberculosis experts had agreed to come to the meeting, including Arata Kochi, the head of WHO's TB program. Farmer had cultivated him. Equally important, Kochi had been a student of Hiat's at the Harvard School of Public Health. Kochi had labored for years to sell DOTS to the world, and I understood his motives. He felt he had to quell the bad publicity Farmer had begun stirring up. Before the meeting, he had decided that WHO should probably have a strategy that included MDR in the treatment. In places where there was significant drug resistance, one of his staff had came up with a new catchy term, DOTS Plus. Some years after the event, Arata Kochi told me, in his clipped English, Japanese is his native tongue, MDH is basically because of human errors. If you can't treat it right, don't do it. Secondly, many countries can't afford it. It's difficult and expensive. And of course we use MDR as a kind of a scare tactics. But in a program review in South Africa, we found 34% of whole TB budget for a few cases of MDR, and they had a lousy DOTS program. We said, use your money for DOTS. Then Paul Farmer came. A very different approach, similar to HIV activists. All good clinicians without significant public health experience. Patients in front of me are the most important things. An unsolvable conflict. They are very articulate, and the issue is they're very emotional. How to react? Tremendous challenge for me. These guys, they are screaming. They want to shoot us. Politically, we have to respond positively. Same time, we need to start a dialogue. Kochi used the term DOTS Plus in his opening remarks at the meeting. That's brilliant. That's great, Kim Jim told him later, over cocktails. So Farmer and Kim got some of what they hoped for from TB before the meeting even started. Speaking about all this some years later, Kochi smiled and said, DOTS Plus, the world is changing. We have to change too. If you can't beat them, join them, he added. Then to some extent, we can't control them. Kochi had made a strategic concession. In effect, he had made MDR treatment discussable, but the discussion itself was just beginning. When panels on international health gather, whether in Switzerland, Indonesia, or Boston, they occupy one space, an environment. A room with a huge table and many tables made into a giant rectangle. bottled water, and name cards on each seat. Over the rattle of coffee cups to the shuffle and click of the side projector, the experts read their prepared remarks, technical terms and acronyms abounding. Now and then old saws. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. In the corridors and hallways outside the lecture rooms, you might, for instance, hear an Italian TB expert say to a Canadian one, I am going to physically aggress him. But inside the rooms, calm usually presides. It's easy to drift away on the voices, imagining colors in the accents, pinks and purples from the Caribbean and the Indian subcontinent, black and white from Japan, and forget what is really going on is the writing of prescriptions that may affect lives of billions. Piat presided, tall and thin, uttering the opening remarks at his usual deliberate pace, as if his tongue weighed every word. The atmosphere was civil, but there were a few heated discussions on scientific issues. An argument of a different sort began on the afternoon of the first day of the meeting, when a bearded man named Alex Goldbarth leaned over his microphone and said in sonorously accented English, So, Russia is a TB nightmare. Goldfarb was a rumpled-looking microbiologist, a former refusnik in the latter days of the Soviet Union. He was working now for the Soros Foundation on the TB epidemic in Russia. 100,000 of that country's prison inmates had active TB, Goldfarb said, and most, if not all, were being treated with the worst possible regimen, with a single drug, because the government hadn't come up with money to buy more. So it is a nightmare. So most of these 100,000 inmates will probably die without ever knowing whether they have MDR TB or not. His group was trying to sort things out and implement some sort of rational approach. They were setting up demonstration projects, DOTS projects, in several places. There was no telling yet how many Russians had MDR, but it was certain the percentage in the prisons was high. So, what to do with these cases? Goldfarb asked. He answered, I do not have the slightest idea. He turned to Farmer. And I would very much like to know, how much drugs did you use for your 53 cases, and how much do they cost? You can probably try to implement MDR treatment, at least in prison. But I don't think it can be done in the community in Russia. But in prison, at least, if there is money. The question is the cost. Farmer mustered the best case he could, but in the end had to name the real figures. I'm not going to say it's not expensive. It's been very costly. I'm not saying that it's not going to be difficult, but I will say, as Dr. Bayona had suggested, that we have managed to overcome those obstacles for the small number of patients, and that leads me to believe that it would be possible ultimately. A PIH ally raised her hand. Costs would only rise if the world delayed in taking on MDR, she said. But another expert said, I am not sure that no matter how compelling a case that this group or any group makes, there's going to be all of a sudden an outpouring of money to treat. Others raised their voices. Another PIH ally declared, I don't think this is a conference of donors, and I don't think we should be expected to come out with these pledges. But to say that this is something that we should pay attention to. I remember signing the oath to assist a patient and do no harm. I really don't remember signing that I would do it in a cost-effective way. There was scattered applause from the young PIHers in the room. I would agree with what that person just said. It is a tough topic to discuss, like for WHO, what people to treat, how much money to spend, but in the end, it's always the doctor's compassion that is the most important thing in healthcare. Then Goldfarb spoke up again, his voice calm and acidic. I want to share with you a simple reality. I have $6 million. With $3 million, I can amplify dots for 5,000 Russian prison inmates. And assuming that 10% have MDR-TB, 4,500 will be cured, and 500 will go down with MDR-TB and die. And there's nothing much you can do. So I have a choice. And my choice is to use another $3 million to treat the 500 with MDR-TB, or go to another region and treat another 5,000. I am working with limited resources, so my choice is not involved in the human rights of 500 people, but 500 people versus 5,000 people. And this is a very practical question for me, because I have $6 million. And the second question is that if I disclose to the Russian people that I spent $6,000 per case in MDR-TB in the prisons with tens of thousands of people dying all around, they will tell me that I am building a golden palace for a selected few. So for those of us who have to make those decisions with limited resources, it's a very serious question. There was consternation in the room. Hiyat had to bang the gavel. He asked Goldfarb if he couldn't see his way of using some of Soros' money, in a pilot project perhaps, to address the question of how MDR affected dots. Well, I'm sorry, Goldfarb retorted. I have to comment. When we talk about Mr. Kochi, who is not doing an experiment, but whose job is to try to control TB globally, there is a different set of priorities. I can't afford doing a pilot project. We are not doing a pilot project. My understanding, said Hiyat pleasantly, is that my former student, Dr. Kochi, is thinking about control of tuberculosis, not just in the 1998 and 99, because he recognizes that he's not going to control the problem worldwide, but is thinking about controlling the problem over the next decade or decades. The young PIHers glared at Goldfarb, but he had made an argument that they'd have to answer, sooner or later. Jim Kim tried rhetoric first in the opening speech the next day. Many people had asked him, he told the crowd, why a little organization like PIH had taken on such a costly and difficult task in Peru. They were right to wonder. We actually had to make a choice that we would not feed 4,000 more children in Haiti, perhaps. And if any of you have been to Haiti, there is hardly anything more morally compelling than the situation of landless peasants in the Central Plateau. But, Jim went on, they had a dream. The dream that someday we might sit in this room, that there might be a TB all-star weekend, he said. We took on this project because we thought that by proving that one could do community-based treatment of multi-drug-resistant TB, we might have the opportunity to work with a room full of people like you, to actually expend resources to a problem that afflicts the populations we serve. Other speakers had talked about the need to generate political will for treating TB, as if each country had to solve its own problem. But Jim said political will was hardly the issue in a place such as Zaire, whose most recent president had stolen about 30% of the money loaned by foreign governments and the World Bank. For places like Zaire, money to deal with TB and MDR would have come from elsewhere. There are more billionaires today than ever before, Jim declared. We're talking about wealth that we've never seen before, and the only time that I hear talk about shrinking resources among people like us, among academics, is when we talk about things that have to do with poor people. The PIH project in Peru could be replicated, and some of what was needed were endorsements from academics with clots and the support of the TB community. Jim said, and let me just conclude my brief remarks here at this TB All-Star Weekend by paraphrasing someone of our tribe, of Paul's tribe, and my tribe of anthropologists. Margaret Mead once said, "Never underestimate the ability of a small group of committed individuals to change the world." He paused. "Indeed, they are the only ones who ever have." That's a very interesting quote to think about. A lot of the times we do question people who don't have much power but try to do a lot of things. But we shouldn't just underestimate them. Apparently, those people are pretty powerful and they're more capable than we think. Chapter 19. Many of the policymakers in TB control had now heard the case. The fine clinical results from Peru and epidemiological evidence that DOTS would fail in a setting of substantial drug resistance. The meeting has also produced, of course, a committee to study the feasibility of DOTS Plus programs, but the arguments about treating MDR were far from over. And in international health near the turn of the 21st century, a mentality nearly opposite to Jim Kim's optimism prevailed. It borrowed from the 19th century utilitarian philosophers, from the notion that one should provide the greatest good for the greatest number, and it was expressed in a language of realism. The world had limited resources. Nations whose resources weren't just limited, but scarce, had to make the best possible use of the little they had. Other countries and international institutions might help out, but these days, if you wanted money from big donors for health projects in poor countries, if you wanted to be taken seriously, your proposals had to pass a test called the cost-effectiveness analysis. The general technique was used first in engineering, later on in war and medicine. You calculated the cost of public health project or medical procedure and tried to quantify its effectiveness. Then you compare the results by competing projects or procedures. Farmer and Kim made similar calculations when trying to decide what to do next in Cambridge. But it seemed to them that the higher councils in international health often use this analytic tool to rationalize an irrational status quo. MDR treatment was cost-effective in a place like New York, but not in Peru. By the time of the meeting in Boston, the project in Peru had begun to establish a new paradigm. It was a challenge to the uses of cost-effectiveness analysis, not only philosophically, but also factually. The World Health Organization had declared MDR treatment largely ineffective, but not on the basis of any substantial trials. Now, Kim and Farmer and Jamie Bayona and the others in Socios had proven that effective treatment was possible, even in a slum in a relatively poor country. Experts in TB control had declared MDR treatment inordinately costly, but no one had tried to reduce the main expense, which was highly priced drugs. Shortly after the Boston meeting, Jim Kim went to WHO headquarters in Geneva. No one he talked to there even knew that the patients on all but one class of the second-line antibiotics had expired years ago, and no one there seemed very interested in when he declared, "We can drive down the price by 90 to 95%. Jim didn't know exactly how to make it happen, make the assertion, then figure out the means. This was his strategy. The big shot strategy, Farmer called it, approvingly. Jim was born in South Korea and grew up in Muscatine, Iowa, in the 1970s. For as long as he could remember, the place had seemed too small for his ambitions. He hardly noticed the Mississippi flowing by the lovely old downtown, or the fragrances of grains on summer nights, or even the famous local produce, the Muscatine melon. He detasseled corn only once, but like every schoolboy in town, he knew Mark Twain had praised Muscatine for its sunsets, and didn't know for decades that Mark Twain had said this only as a joke about his sleeping habits. The sunrises are also said to be exceedingly fine. I do not know. Jim's father had schemed and charmed his way out of North Korea and become proudly Muscatine's periodontist, with an office upstairs on Main Street. Jim's mother had come from South Korea. A grandfather had served as a minister to the last Korean king, and she had studied at Union Theological Seminary with Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, and become a Confucian scholar, and ended up many years as a housewife in Muscatine. A small, elegant woman walking across the local golf course when her children were too young to play alone, diligently trying to make sense of American sports so she could understand her children. At every opportunity, she took Jim and his siblings to Des Moines and Chicago so they'd know that the world was larger than it seemed from Muscatine. She taught her three children, by example, the arts of debate around the kitchen table, while her husband, who had early morning appointments, went to bed grumbling that he didn't know what they had to talk about that was more important than a good night's sleep. She'd tell them to live as if for eternity and tutor them on current events, translating for Jim the images of famine and war that upset him on the TV news. Early on, Jim imagined himself becoming a doctor to treat such sufferings, and excelled in science quickened his interest. He was quarterback on the Muscatine High football team, a starting guard in basketball, the president of his class and its valedictorian. But the Kims were the only Asian family in town, except for the one that owned the Chinese restaurant. When they went to the malls of Iowa, adults stared and children followed them around, the bolder ones approaching, crying out, Kia, and making as if to deliver Karachi chops. For Jim, embarrassment at her parents' Koreanness was the loneliest feeling of all. Go Hawkeye, said his father, booster of all things Iowan, would cry, Koreanizing the cheer for University of Iowa sports team. Jim would correct him, no, Dad, it's Hawkeyes. He went to the University of Iowa and felt liberated there, until he was told that Ivy League schools were better. He transferred to Brown, where he discovered an organization called Third World Center. He became its director. He broke up with his Irish Catholic girlfriend because he suddenly believed that he shouldn't date white women. He made his friends among Black, Hispanic, and Asian students. He learned the pimp walk. On Parents' Weekend, he and his friends would dress up in black and stride around the campus, a phalanx of about 30 African American and Hispanic students, and one Korean, sometimes chanting, sometimes maintaining a threatening silence, and noting with pleasure the double takes and frightened looks on the face of some of the parents. Before Brown, Jim hadn't known that the United States interned Japanese Americans during World War II. He read up on the subject, then lectured about it. He embraced the idea of Asian racial solidarity. He didn't realize back then just how complex a matter could be. He didn't find out until much later, for example, that Koreans are supposed to hate Japanese. From time to time, doubts cropped up. It seemed as if for other Asians at Brown, racial identity meant little more than eating with chopsticks and finding an Asian mate. And the paramount political issue seemed to be the glass ceiling. The fact that Asians weren't yet rising to the very tops of institutions. But the idea of becoming a member in an oppressed minority was very alluring. Jim decided to learn his native language. I wanted to learn Korean, be down with my people, be an authorized third world person. He got a fellowship to travel to Seoul and happened on a very interesting story for his PhD thesis in anthropology. It had to do with Korean pharmaceutical industry. In Seoul, he did his research and made a mighty effort to fit in, hanging out at bars with new Korean friends and performing karaoke. Beforehand, on each occasion, he'd go to the bathroom and studied the words to sounds. He left Iowa prepared, naturally enough, to think that ethnicity was the central problem of his life. By the time he came back from Korea to Harvard to continue medical school and writing his thesis, he had grown bored and had a little disgusted with what was known in academic circles as the politics of racial identity. It seemed like an exercise in selfishness. I discovered South Korea was just doing fine, and that Koreans wanted for me to write grant proposals so they could come to the States to get degrees. I looked at student movements. They were all about Korean nationalism, just sort of troublemaking. Then he met Farmer. He was ready to change directions. At one point during their talks in the old one-room PIH office, Farmer told him, "If you could come to Haiti, I will show you are blonde, as white as any white man." Jim thought of his black, Hispanic, and Asian friends at Brown, and how angry that remark would have made them. He told Farmer that he felt liberated from the self-hatred and evasions of ethnicity that he'd felt in Muscatine. "It's good to have to come to understandings of that, but you've got to put that behind you now," said Farmer. "So what are you going to do now? Be the first Asian to do some stupid talk like walk on the moon?" They hadn't talked long before Jim declared that he wanted to make Farmer's preferential option for the poor his own life's work. All his life, it seemed, Jim had been jumping at the next new thing, the bigger and better thing. Perhaps this was the residue of growing up in Muscatine with a cosmopolitan mother. "You are not Korean. You are Karen," Ophelia told him once. Jim himself said, "I tend to feel problems solved once I've thought it through." Then again, he was fond of overstatement, even when talking about himself. After all, he had stuck with PIH for a decade by now, and done a lot of its most menial chores along the way. What Jim had, above all, was enthusiasm. He'd weigh facts against possibilities, as if the two were equivalent. A lot of students had joined PIH after hearing him talk. Change the world? Of course they could. He really believed this, and he really believed that a small group of committed individuals could do it. He liked to say of PIH, "People think we're unrealistic. They don't know we are crazy." From his research in Korea, Jim already knew that the price of a drug may have little to do with its usefulness or the cost of manufacturing and distributing it. Often the price is high because only one company makes it. A firm can secure its monopoly power through patents, but that wasn't the case with the second-line TB drug. In the world, perhaps as many as 750,000 people suffer from MDR. Treating all of them would require a large quantity of drugs because treatment lasted so long. So the potential market was big, but most people with the disease were poor, so actual demand was very small. Not many companies made the drug. Those that did could pretty much name their price. Eli Lilly was the second-line drug company, for instance. After a long badgering from Farmer, the company was finally selling PIH Caprio in Peru for $21 a vial. Farmer and Kim had bought the same drug, made by Lilly, for $29.90 a vial at the Brigham in Boston. Then they discovered that it only costs $8.80 in Paris, so they had tried to buy Caprio in Paris, but were told they couldn't. There is a global shortage of Caprio, the drug agent in Paris told Farmer on the phone. Why? Farmer asked. There seemed to be an emergency. Where? In Peru. Jim went to Howard Hyatt and told him the story. Looks like price gouging to me, Hyatt said. In fact, so-called differential pricing was standard in the world of large drug companies. Americans paid far more for their products than any other nationality, but Hyatt thought Lilly might want to pick up some good publicity by donating drugs to projects in Peru. He knew a member of Lilly's board. He and Jim went to work on the company, and meanwhile Jim began pursuing other angles. Jim got WHO to agree to hold a meeting to encourage drug companies to produce more second-line antibiotics. He hoped to create competition, which would drive the prices down. This is a very smart move. Then WHO backed out, and Jim convened the meeting himself in Boston. He wasn't above hyperbole or dramatic. At one moment, he put up a list of numbers on the slide projector, describing very large potential demands for second-line antibiotics, in order to impress the drug companies. The numbers themselves were accurate, but the demand they described wasn't real. Because no one contemplating MDR treatment programs had the cash to buy the drugs. The tactic didn't work quite as Jim planned. Out in the audience was a Dutchman in his 20s named Guido Bakker. He worked for a non-profit company, the International Dispensary Association, the IDA. It specializes in driving down the price for essential drugs, the kinds of drugs that poor countries need most urgently. Baker said saw right through Jim's ploy, but he felt angry at the representatives from the non-for-profit drug companies. They started arguing that the prices for second-line TB drugs ought to remain high. Finally, he announced from his seat, IDA is going to do everything we can to lower prices by exploring generic manufacturers. The Dutch group's strategy was to ignore the giant multinational drug companies, the ones that mainly rely on research and brand names and patent protections, and to deal instead with the myriad smaller companies that make and sell at greatly reduced prices already invented generic drugs under different names, as acetaminophen instead of Tylenol in the United States, for instance. This seemed to Jim like a better idea than his own. His fondness for the new and better idea may be his salient weakness, but it sometimes served him well. He didn't care where an idea came from. He was forever reading books about corporate management, looking for tips from capitalists. He embraced Guido Bacher's plan. Ultimately, IDA and the renowned organization Doctor Without Borders took on the job of finding generic manufacturers of second-line drugs. IDA even talked some companies into making the drug, and they assumed responsibility for quality control and distribution, and Doctors Without Borders put up the cash to buy the first shipments. But the other steps came first. Jim's task was like a logician's conundrum. To lower the price of a drug, he had to show that a lot of TB projects would use them. For a lot of projects to use them, the prices had to be lower. For the prices to be lower, the generic manufacturers would get involved. They'd be more inclined to get involved if WHO would put the second-line antibiotics on its official list of essential drugs. But rarely used drugs are by definition not essential. To break through this circular chain, Jim began to lobby WHO for the drug's inclusion on the list. The WHO serves as the coordinating body for virtually all the world's ministries of health. It sets guidelines of standards, publishes recommended approach, acts as an advisory group, where all the information about health and a lot of the complaints go. And it performs some crucial functions as well, such as the collection and dissemination of worldwide epidemiological data, but it is perennially short of money, and like most parts of the United Nations, it is inevitably tangled in bureaucracy. It has a tendency to freeze in the face of controversy. The organization's critic said it in two mottos: slow down and it's not our fault. Even Jim's strongest ally there got frightened when various eminent TB experts wrote to Geneva saying they couldn't countenance the elevation of second-line antibiotics to the essential drug list. Some wrote that the plan wouldn't work. Others believed that if it did and prices fell, then the drugs would become too widely available. This worry had substance. In the real world, many places lacked even rudimentary health services, and others had clinics and hospitals staffed by the ignorant, the careless, and the lazy. In the real world, some doctors and nurses peddled drugs from black markets. Desperate patients sold their antibiotics to buy food, and stupid pharmacists mixed first-line drugs with cough medicine. Some start distributing the second line, the so-called reserve, antibiotics in settings like those, and you would breed resistant strains that no drug could cure. But this was already happening, Jim said again and again. He talked about those patients in Peru who had come to Socios already resistant to second-line antibiotics, a couple of them with TB effectively resistant to every known anti-TB drug. The only way to prevent more of this was sound, well-financed MDR treatment, added on to DOTS. But while Jim believed in that argument, he knew he had to find a mechanism to ensure real control over cheap drugs. He and Paul had just sent a young man to work at Geneva. Jim called him and explained the need for a control mechanism. "See if you can find a precedent," he said. A few days later, the young man called back and said he had found one, an international entity called the Green Light Committee, established to control the distribution of meningococcal vaccine. "That's great," said Jim. "Let's do the same thing. We'll create a committee to control second-line drugs." "What do we call it?" asked the young PIHer. "Red Light Committee would be bad," said Jim. "How about Green Light Committee?" That will make it seem like we're just following precedent. The idea was simple. The committee would serve as the ultimate distributor for second-line drugs. Once prices fell, it would have real power. Any TB program that wanted low prices would have to prove to the committee that they have a good plan and good underlying DOTS program, one that wouldn't breed further resistance. Most TB endorsed the idea, and in a final compromise, WHO placed the second-line antibiotics in an annex to its essential drug list. Oh my gosh, that has been a lot of things they did with WHO. There was a lot of smart strategies to, cut through the bureaucracy and get their work done. The price reductions came in stages. By the year 2000, projects buying through Greenlight Committee paid about 95% less for 4 of the second-line drugs than they would have a few years ago, and 84% less for 2 others. Howard Hyatt and Jim had persuaded Eli Lilly to donate large amounts of 2 antibiotics to PIH, and Lilly had promised to grant other MDR treatment projects vastly lowered prices. Capreomycin now costs 98 cents a vial, 97% less than when Jim and Paul had first borrowed it from the pharmacy at Brigham on their way to Peru. The drugs to treat a 4-drug resistant MDR now cost $1,500 instead of $15,000, and prices were still falling substantially and rapidly. Arguments were far from over, but no one could say anymore that cost alone ruled out treating the disease in poor countries. One member of WHO's TB division, who had initially opposed the Greenlight Committee, took to describing himself as the architect. Others had better claims to credit for the falling prices, including some members of Doctors Without Borders, to whom Jim and Paul had gone for help. But Guido Baker, who was involved in most of the proceedings, told me, "I really see Jim as the one who really did this. He just pushed and pushed and pushed. 85% of it was Jim." Since the start of the project in Lima, Jim and Paul had seen each other less and less frequently. They kept in touch mostly through emails, but they met up at the TB meeting in Salzburg, Australia. Jim found it riveting. Paul nearly fell asleep. Afterwards, they went to dinner alone. Jim and Paul had always shared certain appetites. For a telegraphic expression, O for the P, instead of a preferential option for the poor, and action-adventure movies and people magazines, which they call the Journal of Popular Studies, the JPS. They had similar diets. 2. Farmer dosed everything he ate with salt. Dr. Kim liked to say there are only 2 kinds of plants, stir-fryable and none. Not having a chance to talk face-to-face in a while, they celebrated the occasion by ordering pizza. Jim had a lot on his mind that evening. A few years back, Paul had talked him into training as an infectious disease specialist. After a few months, Jim had quit. He liked doctoring well enough, but Peru had introduced him to medicine on a different scale. It was the big issues surrounding health that excited him, he had realized. He actually liked sitting for hours in conference rooms, talking about operational research in international TB control. But he felt vaguely ashamed to admit that he wanted to have a hand in creating international health policy. As sometimes happened, Paul seemed to know what Jim was thinking. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. There was warmth in the question, Jim felt, a real invitation for him to come clean. "Political work is interesting to me, and it has to be done," he said. I prefer it to taking care of patients. It's all for the P on the international scale." "Well then, do it," Paul said. "But didn't we always say that people who go into policy make a preferential option for their own ideas? For their own sorry asses? Yeah, but Jim, we trust you with the power. We know that you won't betray the poor. Paul's self-assurance had sometimes seemed to fill the space around him and Jim. In the old days, when Paul blew in from Haiti and wanted to talk to Jim, but had to get an appointment, he'd say, "Talk with me," as if everything on his agenda mattered more than anything Jim might have to do himself. For years, Jim used to pick him up at airports, but Paul never did that for him, not once. When they argued, which happened fairly often, Paul usually came out on top, or if he didn't, Jim felt compelled to make him think he had. If Jim praised him, Paul was apt to say something like, "Thanks, Jimbo. I need to hear that." One time, when Jim replied, "Yeah, but why don't you ever say it to me?" Paul seemed surprised. "I do, don't I?" Jim liked to say that he and Paul were twin sons of different mothers. If so, Jim had been born second, and now, over pizza in Salzburg, he had come of age, with Paul's blessing. A lot of farmers had rubbed off on Jim. Over the years, their philosophical views had become virtually indistinguishable, especially on that set of notions which, it seemed to them, international health had adopted as scripture. Jim told me once there had been fundamental frame shifts in what human beings feel is morally defensible, what not. The world doesn't bind women's feet anymore. No one believes in slavery. Paul and I are anthropologists. We know that things change all the time. Culture changes all the time. Advertising people force changes in cultures all the time. Why can't we do that? People in international health sit back and say, "Well, things change for the better?" Who knows? But these Paul farmers, they will drop out. And when they do, we stalwarts will still be here figuring out the best way to spend $2.27 per capita for healthcare. Resources are always limited in international health. This saying had great force. It lay behind most cost-effectiveness analysis. It often meant be realistic, but it was usually uttered, Kim and Farmer felt, without any recognition of how, in a given place, resources had come to be limited, as if God had imposed poverty on places like Haiti. Strictly speaking, all resources everywhere were limited, Farmer would say in speeches. Then he'd add, but they're less limited now than ever before human history. That is, medicine now has the tools for stopping many plagues, and no one could say there wasn't enough money in the world to pay for them. At PIH, though, the saying was true enough. They had spent several millions of Tom White's dollars to buy drugs for Peru. Ophelia had been hoarding up portions of the contributions PIH received, trying to create an endowment for the organization. She managed to put aside about $1 million. Now it was gone, spent on Peru, and White was in his 80s, and as he planned, not very far from the end of his fortune. In early 2000, Ophelia, who was still in charge of the budget, wrote to Paul and Jim, "Boys, we desperately need a big lump of cash, basically with $40,000 per month in salaries, $60,000 to Haiti, and $35,000 to Peru. We can't make it on Tom's money. That is to say nothing of other expenses such as mortgage, health insurance, utilities, blah, blah, blah. Any ideas?" The three devised what they called a disassembly strategy, or out of Tom White's earshot, the post-Tom plan. Because of the falling prices of second-line drugs, they could go on for a while treating patients in Lima. But in a year or two, they'd have to stop. They'd also have to stop financing the research branch of PIH that Paul had founded years ago with his MacArthur money, essentially remained a tiny private charity struggling to support a health system in the corner of Haiti, screaming into the wilderness, as Jim put it. Jim had an alternate vision, of course. In it, PIH would become an instrument for expanding the resources for treating TB, and in the process save itself. They had halted the spread of MDR in the shanty towns of northern Lima. Now they'd propose a project to wipe it out all over Peru. Then they'd go international. They'd show the world that it was possible to beat back that dread disease. And they'd show the world how to do it. And if MDR, why not AIDS? For over a year, Jim had been courting what he called big shot donors. None was bigger than the Gates Foundation. It had an enormous endowment of roughly $22 billion, and it planned to spend about half of the income, about $550 million a year, on projects to improve global health. Howard Hyatt has introduced Jim and Paul to the foundation's senior science advisor, a guy named Bill Foge, one of the people responsible for eradicating smallpox, known to favor unconventional approaches to supposedly impossible problems. Foge had encouraged them, so Jim started putting a grand proposal together. He met up with Paul again, this time in Moscow. They sat on the edges of their bed in a room at the Holiday Inn and talked about how much money to ask for. They argued a little. Paul thought $2 million, maybe $4 million. No, Jim said. We're going to ask for $45 million. They'd never get that much, said Paul. Borrowing one of Paul's favorite gambits in debate, Jim said, on what data exactly do you base that statement? And that is the end of chapter 17. It was very inspiring to learn that Jim and Paul were able to cut through all the bureaucratic obstacles and bring down prices for treating multi-drug resistant TB. And now they need more money, and let's see if they can get $45 million from the Gates Foundation. Thanks for being with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.